This video reveals one of the darkest and most tragic stories history tried to erase. If you want to uncover the pain buried beneath time, stay until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. The morning of August 26, 1346 began with silence. A silence so deep that it made men's hearts race faster. The fields of northern France were still under a pale gray mist, rolling over the hills like breath from a sleeping giant. The village nearby, Crécy-en-Ponthieu, stood quiet, unaware it would soon be written into the black book of history. Through the haze, 9,000 English soldiers waited. Some were farmers, some fishermen. Some had never seen a real battlefield before. Their faces were hard, their hands blistered, their eyes red from days without sleep. But every man held the same weapon, the longbow. A bow taller than most of them, cut from yew wood, curved like the spine of fate. They had come far, crossing seas, rivers, and ruined towns. They had raided, marched, and burned through Normandy, always chased by an enemy far greater in number. Now they stood here, on a ridge of uneven ground, staring into the mist where 30,000 French soldiers waited. Among the English, one young archer named William Hart drew a slow breath. He was 23, a shepherd's son from Yorkshire. He ran his thumb along the rough wood of his bow, tracing the marks his father had carved before he left home. The words read, "Stand fast. Aim true." He looked around. Men were whispering prayers, adjusting arrows, tightening strings. The smell of damp earth and horse sweat filled the air. Some chewed on stale bread, others just stared into the fog, waiting for death or glory. Far beyond the ridge, the French army gathered, a sea of color and steel. Banners flapped in the wind, blue, red, gold, each one painted with lions, fleur-de-lis, and crosses. They were led by King Philip VI, and beneath him marched the pride of France and its knights, men raised since childhood to believe that God himself blessed their armor. They laughed as they saw the English line, a ragged band of archers standing in the mud. To them, this was not a battle. It was a hunt, but pride, when paired with arrogance, is the sharpest blade of all. The sky began to lighten. The mist thinned. From the English ridge, William could now see the valley below, dark, wet, uneven. A trap laid by nature itself. King Edward III had chosen his ground well. The ridge gave height. The mud slowed cavalry, and the archers had stakes planted in front. Sharpened wooden spears angled toward the valley to impale charging horses. Edward rode along the line, calm and silent. He looked like a man carved from stone. When he spoke, his voice carried through the mist like a blade. Let every man who loves England stand his ground today. There was no cheering, no chanting, only nods, only the sound of men tightening bowstrings. The French knights moved first. Their horses stamped impatiently, the sound echoing like thunder rolling through a storm cloud. The morning wind shifted, carrying the scent of mud and sweat toward the English. William felt it, the first tremor in his chest. He looked at the valley and whispered, "They're coming." A murmur spread through the English line. Then silence again, only the faint rustle of feathers as arrows were set to strings. From the French ranks came a blare of horns, deep and proud. Armor flashed in the rising sun like mirrors of fire. The charge began. It started as a rumble, then a roar. Thousands of horses thundered forward, hooves smashing into the wet ground, throwing up mud and water. The knights lowered their lances. Their banners streamed behind them like flames. William swallowed. His hands trembled for half a breath and then steadied. He raised his bow, drew the string to his ear, waited for the command. The English captain shouted over the wind, "Knock! Draw! Loose!" The first volley of arrows rose like a black wave into the sky. The sound, a hiss that filled the air like a storm of snakes. Every man on the ridge watched them vanish into the gray clouds. A heartbeat later and they fell. The sound of impact was sickening. Metal, flesh, bone. Horses screamed. Knights shouted. The front ranks of the French charge collapsed into chaos, but William didn't stop to watch. He reached for another arrow, and another. Each shot was a rhythm, each breath a heartbeat. The valley became a storm of death, and the sky above Crécy darkened, not with clouds, but with arrows. Still, the French kept coming. Wave after wave, their pride louder than reason, their armor heavier than hope. Edward watched from the ridge, his face expressionless. He knew, Once the storm began, there was no stopping it. Down in the valley among the knights, one man named Geoffroy de Montclair, a noble from Picardy, tried to rally his men. He raised his sword and shouted, "Forward! For France! For honor!" But his horse stumbled in the mud, struck by an arrow. He fell hard, his armor clanging as he hit the ground. He looked up just in time to see another wave of arrows fall like rain from hell. In that moment, Geoffroy realized the truth. Honor dies fast when the sky itself turns against you. On the ridge, William lowered his bow for a brief moment. He saw the valley filled with movement, chaos, and blood. And yet above it all he heard only the wind. The same wind that carried his arrows, his fear, and his fate. The first hour of the Battle of Crécy had begun. By nightfall, it would change the meaning of war forever. The silence before the storm was over. The first hour of battle had come and gone, but the storm had only begun. The valley below the English ridge was no longer a field. It was a cauldron, boiling with men, horses, and screams. Mud churned under hooves. Arrows hissed down like rain, and pride once shining in the sunlight was drowning in the dirt. The French knights, blinded by rage and humiliation, reorganized. They refused to accept that peasants, archers, had halted them. Each charge they made was supposed to restore their honor, but each one only fed the graveyard forming beneath them. King Philip VI watched from a distance, his banner fluttering weakly in the smoky air. Around him, his commanders argued, shouting over the thunder of hooves and the whine of arrows. But pride has a sound of its own, deafening. At the front, Geoffroy de Montclair, his armor now caked with mud, climbed back to his feet. His horse was dead beside him, a black destrier pierced by a dozen arrows. He pulled his sword from its sheath, the steel gleaming with blood and rain. He could barely hear anything over the screams, but one thought pounded through his skull. Not like this. Nearby, a trumpet blared again. The second French assault had begun. Hundreds of Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries, moved forward in a loose line. Their job was to weaken the English before the knights charged again. But their bows were slow, their strings weakened by rain. Each man had to load, crank, and aim before firing. And while they worked, the English archers already had their next arrows drawn. From the ridge came the sound of command again. "Loose!" The sky turned black. The Genoese didn't stand a chance. Their armor was light, their shields thin. Arrows ripped through them like wind through reeds. In panic, they turned and ran, back toward their own knights. It was a fatal mistake. The French nobles, mistaking retreat for cowardice, saw red. Their fury boiled over. "Traitors!" they shouted. "Cowards!" And then chaos. The knights charged straight into their own men. Steel trampling flesh, swords cutting through their allies. Blood mixed with rain, forming rivers of red that ran down the slope. On the ridge, William Hart and his fellow archers watched in disbelief. They had seen war before, but not madness like this. William's friend, a gray-haired bowman named Thomas Pike, spat into the mud. "They're killing their own," he murmured. William said nothing. He simply raised his bow again. "Loose!" Another volley soared. The sound was endless now, a rhythm of death. Draw, aim, release. The sky hissed. One French knight tried to charge uphill, his armor gleaming with gold, his plume a bright red streak against the gray sky. An arrow struck his throat. He fell without a sound, face first into the mud. Behind him, more knights stumbled, slipping on the bodies of the dead. Horses screamed as arrows found their bellies. The valley became a trap, a pit of pride. From the English side, drums beat steadily. They did not celebrate. They did not cheer. Each man simply did what he had been trained to do: survive. The French made a third charge, then a fourth, each one weaker than the last, each one swallowed by mud, steel, and fear. By now the rain had stopped, but the ground was thick, sucking at the boots of men like quicksand. Knights who fell could not rise again. Their armor pinned them, their lungs filled with water and blood. Some clawed at their helmets, gasping for air, suffocating under the weight of their own pride. Geoffroy de Montclair fought his way forward through the carnage. He had lost his helmet, his sword slick with blood. Everywhere he looked, chaos. No order, no command, no hope. He shouted for his banner, but there was no answer. Only arrows, only death, and then he saw it in a boy. 16 years old at most, wearing the crest of the Black Prince, the English king's son. He was shouting orders, his young face streaked with dirt. Men obeyed him, calmly, without fear. The prince was holding the line himself. Geoffroy realized too late that this was no rabble. This was an army that understood something the French had forgotten. That discipline, not birthright, wins wars. From the ridge, William saw the French lines crumble again. He could see their eyes now, wide with disbelief, their armor dented, their banners fallen. He drew one last arrow, the fletching rough beneath his fingers. He aimed high toward the sun breaking through the clouds, and as he released it, he whispered to himself, "For home." The arrow found its mark. Another night fell. Another legend ended. By late afternoon, the field of Crécy was unrecognizable. Smoke and mist clung to the ground. The cries of the dying echoed through the valley like prayers no god would answer. The French king's standard wavered, then disappeared. Even the royal guard began to retreat. The proudest army in Europe, shattered by peasants with bows. King Edward watched quietly. He gave no triumphant cry, no victory shout, only silence. He knew this was not a moment of glory, but of change. The world had turned a page, and what lay on the next one would never be the same. As the sun sank low, the light turned red, the color of blood reflected on steel. The field shimmered like fire. William dropped to his knees, his hands raw, his quiver empty. The ground beneath him was covered in the bodies of men who, hours ago, believed themselves untouchable. He looked out over the valley and whispered to the wind, "They came for honor. They found truth." The arrows had spoken, louder than any king, priest, or knight ever could, and across France, the echo of that truth began to spread. The age of the night was dying. Evening came slowly over Crécy, heavy, gray, and thick with smoke. What had once been a proud battlefield was now a graveyard without graves. The valley below the English ridge was carpeted in armor, horses, and men, a twisted tapestry of flesh and steel. The air stank of blood and iron, the kind of smell that never leaves your memory, even after a lifetime. The kind of silence that comes only after too much screaming. William Hart stood at the ridge's edge, bow lowered, his fingers blistered and blackened from the cord. He could barely feel them anymore. The archers around him were quiet now, not from fear, not from victory, but from exhaustion. Every arrow they had carried had found its mark. Every man in their ranks had done his part. And still the French had kept coming. Below, Geoffroy de Montclair crawled across the mud. He had lost his sword, his armor dented and torn, his vision half blurred from blood. He didn't know if the battle was over, or if he was simply the last one left alive. He tried to rise, but the weight of his breastplate pulled him back down. He could hear men drowning, not in water, but in mud, suffocating beneath their own armor. The valley was eating them alive. From the English side, faint calls rang out. "Collect arrows! Tend the wounded!" But even the victors sounded hollow, their voices swallowed by the mist that returned as night fell. King Edward's campfires began to flicker across the ridge, small dots of orange light glowing against the endless gray. Men began to whisper, not songs of triumph, but prayers for the dead. William sat beside the broken stake line, watching the valley below. He could hear the moans, faint, endless. 1,000 men crying for water, for mercy, for death. He turned to Thomas Pike, the older archer beside him. Thomas stared at his hands. They shook, not from cold, but from what they had done. "They'll write songs about this day," William said quietly. Thomas looked up, his eyes empty. "Aye," he replied, "but they won't sing them here, in the valley." Geoffroy dragged himself toward what he thought was a body of a comrade, but it wasn't. It was his own horse, the animal's eyes glassy, its flank pierced with arrows. He rested his head against it and whispered, "Forgive me." For his pride, for his blindness, for leading his men into a storm they could never survive. Above him, the sky began to open again. Rain fell, soft and cold, washing over the dead. Every drop struck armor and pooled in the hollows of helmets, tiny mirrors of the dying light. Then came the lightning. For a moment, the entire field flashed white. And in that instant, William saw what the darkness had been hiding. The faces. Thousands of them. Eyes open, staring into nothing. Men who had once been the pride of France, now indistinguishable from the mud that held them. He turned away. He couldn't look anymore. The English camp remained quiet that night. No celebration, no laughter, only the sound of distant rain and the rustle of canvas as men tried to sleep beneath the weight of what they'd seen. King Edward sat alone beneath his tent, his armor removed, his sword beside him. He wrote by candlelight, his quill trembling with every drop of wind. In his journal he wrote, "This day was given to us by God, though at a cost too heavy for joy." He ordered that the wounded, friend or foe, be given water. But there were too many. The valley was an ocean of the dying. Down in that sea of death, Geoffroy felt a hand clutch his arm. He turned. A fellow knight younger, his face pale beneath his dented visor. "Brother," the man gasped. But Geoffroy had no strength to answer. He simply held his comrade's hand until the grip went slack, and then he let go. He lay there, staring up into the rain. Each drop stung like a reminder. Each breath felt borrowed. He thought of his home, the stone halls, the warmth of his wife's voice, the laughter of his sons. And he wept, not for defeat, but for the death of the world he had believed in. The knight's age, of shining valor, of mounted pride, had ended in a pit of mud. And the world would never go back. By midnight, the English fires burned low. The archers lay huddled beneath cloaks, shivering. William couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, the knights falling, the horses screaming, the sky raining death. He whispered a prayer, but the words felt small. He looked to the stars, faint behind drifting clouds, and wondered if heaven had turned away. In the distance, thunder rolled again. Or maybe it was the echo of hooves that would never ride again. As dawn approached, the wind carried a new sound, the flutter of crows gathering. They came by the hundreds, circling the valley, perching on spears, armor, bodies, feasting on what was left of pride. William turned away, gripping the bow that had given him victory and nightmares. He knew that in the eyes of the world he was a hero, but standing there, watching the blackbirds descend, he didn't feel like one. He felt like a man who had broken something sacred, something that could never be repaired. And down below, beneath the weight of his shattered armor, Geoffroy closed his eyes at last. As the rain fell and the crows cried above him, he whispered his final words. "Let the earth take us all." Then silence again, only the wind moving across the fields. Only the memory of what once was. The horror of Crécy wasn't just in how many died, but in how the world learned to live with it. When the morning sun rose over Crécy, it did not shine on glory. It shone on ruin. Everywhere the mist parted, it revealed fragments of men who had once believed themselves invincible. The ground was slick and red, helmets half buried, banners torn, horses bloated where they fell. The air had the thick sweetness of rot already beginning. The English moved carefully among the dead. They weren't victors now, only survivors among ghosts. William Hart walked with his bow unstrung, boots sinking in the mire. He stepped past the broken lance of a fallen knight and found a ring, silver, still gleaming. He turned it in his hand and wondered if it belonged to someone loved. He placed it on a nearby rock, whispering, "Someone will come for you." Around him, men gathered arrows from corpses, pulling shafts from flesh and armor. Every arrow reclaimed was a reminder of what it had done. The English army had fired nearly 1,000,000 that day, each one guided by breath and fate. Thomas Pike joined him, face pale, hands trembling. "Never thought they'd fall like that," he muttered. William didn't answer. There was no pride in this kind of victory, only a quiet dread that they had changed the world forever. From the ridge, King Edward watched as priests moved among the dead, offering final rites. Some bodies were too mangled to tell who they had been: French, English, noble, peasant. The mud made them all the same. A messenger approached the king, bowing low. "Sire, we found the banner of King Philip's guard." Edward nodded, eyes heavy. "Take it down," he said. "Let the wind rest." Far across the valley, survivors crawled from the shadows. A few French men-at-arms staggered toward the river, dragging their wounds, calling for help that would never come. Among them was Geoffroy de Montclair. Barely alive, his face pale as wax, he had spent the night half buried under his fallen horse. The cold had kept him breathing. The mud had kept him hidden. When the sun touched his face, he opened his eyes and saw England's banners fluttering above. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he laughed, a quiet, broken sound. Not from madness, but from realization. The age he was born to defend had ended here before his eyes. By midday, the smell of death rolled thick across the valley. The English burned piles of broken weapons to keep the disease from spreading. The smoke rose high, black against the morning light. William sat apart, sharpening an arrowhead on a stone. He could hear the king's heralds reading the names of fallen nobles, both English and French. The list went on for hours. When it ended, no one cheered. In the distance, thunder rolled again, but this time it wasn't the storm. It was the sound of carts arriving to collect the dead. Some French peasants crept out of the nearby woods, crossing themselves as they stepped into the field. They moved silently, lifting bodies into wagons, whispering prayers. When one peasant passed William, he looked up and whispered, "You've killed the old world, Englishman." William didn't reply. He just stared at the valley, at what was once the pride of France, now silent under the crows. King Edward sat with his commanders, his son, the Black Prince, beside him. They spoke softly, voices thick with fatigue. The young prince, only 16, had fought bravely, and now his father looked at him with quiet awe. "You've seen what honor costs," Edward said. The boy nodded. "Yes, father." "And what pride destroys." Outside the tent, the rain began again. Thin, cold, endless. It hissed against the armor left piled in heaps, ran through the blood-soaked ground and washed the valley clean. Or tried to. That night, the campfire light reflected in puddles that looked like molten gold. Men whispered stories of the battle, each one darker than the last. Some swore they had seen knights trampled by their own horses. Others said they heard voices in the wind calling their names. William lay awake, staring at the sky. He remembered the moment the first wave broke. The sound of hooves like thunder, the whine of arrows cutting through it. He remembered the look in their eyes, the knights who never saw the ground rushing up to meet them. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Down in the valley, Geoffroy still breathed. Barely. He crawled toward a ruined chapel on the hill's edge, a small stone building half shattered by siege. Inside, he found a cross still standing. He fell before it and whispered, "If this is what God wished, then perhaps we were never his chosen." The wind outside carried the sound of English horns, victory horns. He smiled faintly. "Victory," he said. And yet, no one wins. He died there alone under the eyes of a wooden Christ who had seen too many wars. The army moved on, banners lifted, boots heavy, faces pale. They left behind a field no one would ever forget, though few would speak of it. As they marched, the crows rose behind them in a black storm, circling the place where chivalry had died. The echo of Crécy would reach every corner of Europe. Kings would rethink their armies. Knights would begin to vanish. And the bow, simple, silent, and common, had changed the world forever. William looked back one last time. The wind brushed through the grass, whispering over the dead. He whispered back, "We were only men, and we did what men always do." Then he turned and walked on, toward Calais, toward the next war, toward history. Crécy, 1346, where the age of knights ended and the age of men began. History did not end at Crécy, but something inside it broke. When the battle was over, when the last arrow had fallen silent, the world had already changed, though no one yet understood how deeply. The year was 1346. Europe stood at a crossroads. And on that muddy field in northern France, the old gods of war had died quietly, trampled under the weight of their own pride. For centuries, the knight had been a symbol of perfection, steel-clad, blessed by church and crown, a holy weapon of the aristocracy. To be a knight was to be more than a man. It was to be a myth, but myths are fragile. And at Crécy, the myth met the arrow. A simple bow, carved by hand, drawn by calloused fingers, tore through everything the world believed about power. The longbow was no royal secret, no noble weapon. It belonged to the people, to farmers, hunters, shepherds, to those who bent their backs to the soil by day and bent the world to their will by night. For months, stories spread like smoke across Europe. In the taverns of England, men spoke of the miracle at Crécy. In the courts of France, silence hung heavy. Kings whispered to their priests. Generals burned their parchments. And somewhere in the heart of Europe, the future began to turn its gears. New armies would rise. leaner, colder, made of men who fought not for honor but for survival. Steel would be replaced by strategy, horses by arrows, and pride by precision. The world had watched the sons of peasants bring down the lords of France, and it could never unsee it. A monk sits beneath candlelight, writing the chronicles of Crécy. His quill trembles. He writes of God's will, of England's valor, of France's sorrow, but in his heart he knows what really happened. He pauses, ink dripping, and whispers, "It was not heaven that chose them. It was the bow." He looks out the window, sees boys in the courtyard practicing archery, the same way their fathers had. The whisper of the bowstring has become the hymn of a new age. William Hart, now older, tends a small field near Devon. His bow hangs above the door, unstrung. He rarely speaks of Crécy, but every night when the wind changes, he hears it again. The storm of arrows, the screams of horses, the silence after the charge. His son, Thomas, asks him one evening, "Father, what was it like?" William stares at the horizon for a long time, then says quietly, "It was the day the sky rained iron, and men learned fear." He looks down at his hands, the same hands that once held the power to end empires. He flexes them slowly, as if they still remember the string's pull. Then he says, "Never forget, boy, we are all just flesh. The armor only delays the truth." Years later, the sons of nobles wander through broken corridors once filled with music. The banners are faded, the hall's cold. One of them touches a rusted sword on the wall and asks, "What did they die for?" An old servant answers from the doorway, "For the world that couldn't last." But Crécy's shadow didn't fade. It stretched across generations, into Poitiers, into Agincourt, into every battlefield where men dared to rise against kings. Every time a soldier loosed an arrow, every time a peasant raised his head, the ghosts of Crécy stood behind him, whispering, guiding, reminding him that power was never meant to belong to the few. And yet, progress is cruel. The longbow would one day be replaced by gunpowder, by machines, by men who never saw their enemies' eyes. Each step forward brought new strength and new distance, from courage, from conscience, from the human soul itself. The bow had ended one kind of war, but it had opened the door to something worse, a future where men could kill without seeing the face they struck, a future born in the mud of Crécy. Centuries later, the field is quiet again. Grass covers the scars. The wind hums softly through the hills as if retelling the story to the earth itself. No one remembers William. No one remembers Geoffroy. Only the silence remembers. And the sky that once rained arrows. If you walk there today, you'll find nothing but soil and wind. But listen closely, and you'll hear the faint whisper of strings being drawn, the echo of men who changed history, not with crowns or swords, but with wood, sinew, and faith. The Battle of Crécy was not just a victory, it was a funeral, for the age of knights, for the illusion of invincibility, for the idea that courage wore armor, and from its ashes rose a new world, where the common man held the power of kings, and history itself learned to kneel.